We're live.
Great, thank you. Welcome. This is a regular scheduled meeting of the Business Economic Development Committee. It's Monday, August 18th. It is 5:36. Committee members include Councillor Fish, Councillor Hawes, Councillor Leonard, Councillor Mauer, and myself, Councillor Fournier. Joined at the table are Councillor Dean and Councillor Beck. Also with us is Business Economic Development Director. I'm always forgetting. With that, first up on the agenda is a code change request, safe zones.
In the city solicitor's office, Grace is here to present that.
Hi, Grace, it's nice to see you guys. So we're here to request that Taylor Field be designated as a safe zone. Safe zones are allowed under state law. A municipality may designate areas that are like athletic fields, parks, playgrounds, or recreational facilities that are frequented by minors. And these designated safe zones allow police to charge individuals committing drug crimes in those zones with aggravated crimes, with the goal of limiting those drug crimes near minors. Currently, we have 29 designated safe zones in the city, and this would just be the 30th one. Taylor Field is where the Bangor Little League practices, and so we were approached by Bangor Little League to designate this as a safe zone, and so we did a bunch of research and I'll do this.
Great. Questions, comments? The only comment I have is thanks for including the other 29 listed that helped guide me as far as my thought process goes. Any other comments, questions? Councillor Beck?
Good question. So when is it designated as a safe zone? Does it get like a signage?
Yes, so there will be an informational sign that the police will post there, and it explains that this heightens drug crimes in the area.
Having to accept the motion to move this on to council.
Second.
Motion made second. Questions, comments? So we'll move on to council. Thank you. Thank you, Grace. Next up, CDBG program consolidated plan.
Yep, our community development officer, Robin Stanek, is here to do a presentation on the consolidated.
Thank you very much. We've talked a lot about the consolidated plan, but what I'm going to share with you today is really exciting because it's the culmination of about a year of research that we've used to put together the first piece of our plan. The consolidated plan is a complementary document to some of the other plans that we use in the city, and it addresses the living conditions within the city primarily for use in communities that receive federal funding. So it's really important to remember the context of this plan is actually used not only by the city, but other communities and other entities will actually call us and ask us for a copy of the plan because they're required to make sure that it aligns with our plan. So it's a really important document, and I'd like to share with you a little bit today of some of the things that we found. Okay, so do I just say next slide? That works? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so every 5 years we have to go through this process. It's important to get up-to-date information about what's going on in Bangor. And so the study is to identify some of the more critical gaps and needs in Bangor. And the plan is built around 3 main goals. And these goals, some of you will be familiar with, that serve as guideposts for administering funding, such as the CDBG program. Next slide, please, ma'am. So the 3 community development goals include fostering livable neighborhoods. So we make strategic investments to improve public infrastructure and enhance community amenities to ensure that residential areas are safe, attractive places to live, raise families, and which are accessible to all residents of Bangor. We also focus on decent housing, so the city will increase the supply of safe, affordable housing with support for the development and rehab of housing, which meets the varied shelter needs of all city residents. Through environmental remediation and historic restoration, the city will ensure that development is responsive and responsible. And then we look at economic vitality to invest in our industry sectors to attract businesses that provide a range of products and services which enhance the satisfaction and well-being of residents and visitors. The city aims to increase the likelihood that city residents contribute meaningfully to the community while achieving financial stability through participation in the labor force. So the purpose of the plan is to stay grounded in these goals. And as we focus on these principles, we've found that our work complements all of the other work that the city, that takes place in the city and contributes to the effectiveness of those efforts. So next slide, please. So this is a data-driven analysis. We use a variety of tools. So for the data to be consistent, it should be measuring the same thing in the same way, which allows us to compare it well. Our first challenge was finding local statistics as opposed to county or state level data. When obtaining Bangor's data was not possible, we have made some extrapolations using Penobscot County data, noting that Bangor is a service center to the county and the greater Bangor region, so it is comparable. Another challenge we found is that because the census is taken once every 10 years, comparing the most recent data from 23 and 2024 fell outside those bounds. So we use the American Community Survey, which is a smaller yearly survey conducted by the Census Bureau. The sample size is smaller than the 10-year census, but we can access the yearly data or trends that are published using 5-year estimates of that data and establish those trends in the census and kind of tease out some more detail here. Finally, some really important data is contained in reports and plans that we have already published, such as the housing study, our comprehensive plan, and our community health assessment that was published by Bangor Public Health. Next slide, please. One of the things that we do in this plan is we look at specific frameworks to help interpret and filter the information that we've received. Some of the most helpful ones are the Maine Economic Growth Council measures of growth, as well as the vital conditions framework that the city of Bangor used in its community health needs assessment. And then here, I included a graphic. This is called the Community Capitals Framework, which actually uses a community assets model to show the different areas of strengths in a particular community. So you have natural capital, cultural capital, we have social capital, physical and economic capital, and then rounding out these capital stocks is human capital, which the knowledge, skills, competencies, and other attributes embodied in individuals that facilitate the creation of personal, social, and economic well-being. So that is just a sample of the frameworks that we used for this study. Next slide, please. So we had some key themes that we found from this needs assessment and into certain conditions. So we focused on the characteristics of people and what we think we know about them. This is mainly related to health, housing, and assessing the risk of these conditions on vulnerable populations. So we found severe housing problems. 32% of all Bangor households experienced at least one of the following housing problems. So substandard housing, overcrowding, or cost burden. The most common was in the cost burden category. We found disproportionately greater need with different population characteristics, mostly non-white households with incomes below 30% or 50% of the area median income were more often impacted by housing problems. We also found that the housing cost burden which involves spending more than 1/3 of your monthly income on housing. 16% of households spent more than half of their income on housing. And then in homelessness, we found data that was available that indicated 292 people experienced homelessness on any given day in 2024, among whom 210 or 72% were sheltered and 82 were unsheltered. And so then we looked at special needs populations. It can be difficult to find specific data on special needs populations, including seniors, people with disabilities, people with substance use disorder, people living with HIV, and those fleeing or attempting to flee various forms of gender-based violence is really limited. So it's important to think about the resources that are available to serve them, even though we might not have the data to support specific numbers. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're looking at housing needs and we're thinking about all of these population characteristics. So we looked at some demographic trends, household composition. We looked at specific housing problems. We looked further at the cost burden issue. We asked some questions about housing assistance and public housing, and then we looked further into those special needs populations and their housing needs. If you want to go to the next, after this, next slide. Okay, so for population statistics, what we're really looking at is our population growth and migration patterns, where people are moving to, where they're moving from. We're looking at the age distribution and how that relates to households. We wanted to learn about the race and ethnicity distribution in the city, and then about income, education, and public health. Next slide. Okay, so this is the first of many infographics here. So let me explain what we're looking at. So in 2010, the census confirmed that we had about 33,000 people. And since that time, approximately 1,500 people have vanished, not really vanished. But there are data sources that can tell us exactly where they went, but that's harder to access. But we can tell where people are moving to Bangor from and how that influences our current population, which was 31,000 in 2024. So those estimates confirm that foreign and domestic migration had a large impact on rural states, such as Maine. In 2024, the state saw an influx of 5,300 people. In Bangor, domestic migration within the county, within Maine, or from a different US state totaled about 18%, and residents which moved to Bangor from another country accounted for less than 1% of this trend. And so then this next graphic that you see is actually the population growth year over year. So the reason that you're seeing those lines go above and below this zero line is because there are specific years in which our growth, for example, in 2020, our growth in Bangor increased by 3%. But then again, in 2021, it actually didn't grow more than 0.3% and even dropped. We lost some folks in 2023, and then in 2024, our population grew from 23 numbers to 24, about 2.5%. So not small numbers when you're thinking about, 31,000 people. So next slide, please. So now oh, that's nice, colorful. Now we're looking at our selected characteristics. So our multicultural composition probably is not surprising, but we have a lot of white people in Bangor. But we also do have a large number of Native American and indigenous population moving from within Penobscot County within the city. And we expect this trend to continue as from an economic development standpoint, the city continues to enrich Bangor with a lot of welcoming and culturally diverse people. We also found that our median age actually went down, 40.7 down from 42. So it continues to get younger. What you also see is we have just under 24% of our population is 62 and older. And about 18% of our population are children. So, next slide, please. So let's look a little bit at individual households. So we had 31,000 residents. Those are filtered into about 13,000 households. One interesting thing that we found is that even though the number of older adults in Bangor has actually reduced by quite a bit, the number of households that include a person that is over 60 comprises almost the largest share of the households in Bangor. And that is actually close seconded by single households, so people living alone. It's probable that those households that have an older member are also older members living alone. So there is some overlap in some of those numbers. But then also note that the 14 and 11%, when combined, that's 25% of our households include a child under 18. Now, when you think about families and households, it's important that we were looking at the relationship aspect of households and households with children. We know that this has a social impact on families, especially an economic impact on families, if someone is raising children alone. And then also thinking of, when you get older, what is your family composition and your relationships? And it does have an effect both economically and on a community health scale. Thank you. Okay, so this image displays the source of income for Bangor residents. Just over 25% of residents live below the federal poverty line. Some of these are on fixed incomes. So you see in the leftmost part of the screen, families that have Social Security, retirement income, their average income is about $20,000 a year. Some older adults do have also retirement income, so that gives that a boost. And then the average annual income for those that are bringing home wages is about $87,000. And that is the average. It's important to remember that sometimes we talk about median income, which is the middle figure in a line of figures. So 50% of those figures will be higher than the median and 50 below. So this is actually talking about the average. So sometimes that can be skewed by having very, very large incomes and then very small and trying to find a middle number there. And then cash public benefits, you actually can't see. It's such a tiny square. But just 2% of Bangor residents receive like some type of cash benefit, like a TANF benefit or something like that. Next slide, please. All right, so we wanted to know a little bit more about our income and poverty statistics. So HUD publishes an area median income, and in their calculations, they build in a couple of factors. So they take into account family size. And so the census actually built a special table
of median family income estimates, and HUD uses it as a basis for calculating these area median income numbers, which is used for eligibility for many different programs. So it's a really important number, and to understand like how they arrive at that number. So those income limits are adjusted annually to account for inflation, to ensure that they reflect the cost of living. So up until this year, HUD was using the Consumer Price Index to measure inflation. However, this year they changed it to the national per capita wages, the change in the per capita wages. So we actually don't know how effective that's actually going to be at measuring inflation, because we've just got 1 year of that data. But this right-hand graph, you can see the sort of shaded blue area is the rise in area median income. And then the whiter portion is the inflation factor per year. So you can see actually that in 2023, the inflation factor actually rose that area median income by about $10,000. And then as you move from 2024 into 25, it looks pretty steady. But it would be interesting to track this over more of a long term. So that measures some of our economic conditions and the effect that it has on individual incomes, because as we see sort of anecdotally, it's nice to be able to go back to the data and see what we are experiencing in the numbers. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to look a little bit more at education and see how kids are getting a good start to live in these economic conditions. And they have a really great opportunity in the Bangor School Department. We actually saw that graduation rates in 2024 were at an all-time high and exceeded their goals in their plan. They planned to reach 90%. They actually reached 92%. And that's compared with the national average of 86% and the state of 87% in the state of 86. So one thing that we found also is that low-income students are graduating at higher rates than the state average for moderate income students, but below the average for all students. So they're still performing pretty well, at this school. Also, what we wanted to look at were the reading and math scores. This is typically done at either a 4th grade level or an 8th grade level with these specific assessments. And we found that we're looking at, the middle school scores. So we decided to compare both the Dowdy and Cohen School. One thing that you can note about that is the Dowdy School and Cohen School have different socioeconomic status profiles, where the Cohen School students are typically from families with higher incomes than the Dowdy School. So you can see that the schools performed a little bit differently, with the Cohen School actually outperforming the Dowdy School by a significant amount, yet for the entire school district, reading and math scores were fairly comparable, except math scores for the Bangor district eclipsed the state score. So that's another feather for our education system. So then we look a little bit at, adults and what the educational level is in Bangor, and we find that there's only a very small amount of people that do not have a high school diploma. Most people have a high school degree, and then many have gone off to do some college. And then the graduate school, the 4-year college is sort of the teal color, and then graduate school is actually that darker blue color. So we do have a mix of folks that have a varying range of degrees and credentials. Another thing that we found is that the number of students that are eligible to take the SAT and the ACT is actually 11% that actually take it. So this is an area that we were curious about. you know, potentially students that are moving on to other things after graduation, maybe there's some opportunities there that could be strengthened. Next slide, please. So this is another way of looking at the same graph that we saw on the previous page. And you'll see that less than ninth grade education, so this kind of breaks it out a little bit further. So ninth grade education, 9th to 12th, and these are also, again, 25 plus. So no diploma, high school graduate or equivalent, just under 30% of the population, and then the remaining population has some form of post-secondary. In the some college, no degree, that also includes folks that have certifications and things that are not specifically degrees. So it's really important to note that there's some credit there for that type of thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so we wanted to look at our public health and wellness. It's really important to remember how much public health really influences community health, economic health. I mean, we did get a great big lesson in 2020 about how much that is really interrelated. So what we wanted to look at specifically were, you know, information about our people, but then how it's affecting our community. So to compare healthcare access, the number of providers per 10,000 people has actually decreased for Penobscot County. And in Bangor, you know, this is where all of the providers are between Bangor and Brewer. We really have, you know, the nexus of where you can go for healthcare, especially acute care. So the state average for obtaining a primary care doctor in the United States is 1,330 to 1. And yet in Bangor, we're looking at 740 to 1. So we're doing a little bit better than the national average. So as a regional supplier of healthcare as being one of our major industries, and from a public health standpoint, we see this as a pretty important metric. So how can we continue to drive up the number of quality staff and improve the access to healthcare for local consumers is one of the things that we need to look at next. Note the low percentage of residents without healthcare coverage. That's a really tiny number. 7% of all residents are without healthcare coverage. That's really important to think about the, you know, stress and strain on hospitals and things like that without having coverage. However, we found that a high percentage of kids are needing help with healthcare. And one of the things that we looked at was immunization rates. So across the state, 92% of children received a Tdap vaccine. And that's compared to just 59% of all adults up to date on their tetanus shot. That is really wild, considering the fact that, you know, sometimes we don't think about, oh, it's been 10 years, do I need my booster? Like, we don't think about it as adults because there's no one giving us our little schedule like we did with our kids. But the state funds free or nearly free pediatric vaccines. So that can sometimes also explain the difference between those two numbers. And also, if you're wondering, you know, we actually have a 75% vaccination rate against COVID-19. So that's actually really, really good. It's better than almost every other major city. But we also have the 2 largest acute care facilities in the area. So we do get a lot of accurate data. So that is related to COVID-19. Next slide, please, Courtney. Sorry. I don't like looking at that. We also wanted to look a little bit at some lifestyle. So physical activity and healthy weight. 31% of Bangor's residents are overweight for their height. And then 23% of adults report that they have no leisure time physical activity. So thinking about just from an infrastructure standpoint, This relates to what kind of opportunities do we have to, get outside, to, be active, to do different types of activities that would promote physical wellness. And then we also looked at high school and middle school students, and their numbers are pretty low as well. There are also a few major diseases and conditions that also help us to shape, how healthy the city is. And the biggest ones are cardiovascular disease and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is called COPD. And a lot of times it accompanies something like emphysema, and these are, related to people, most of the time related to people that are smokers. And so these numbers actually show that we're a little bit higher in the scale for cardiovascular disease, but we actually have a reduced number of people that are smokers. Drug deaths, though, this is where we kind of claim more numbers. We had 490 people that died of a fatal drug overdose in 2024. 18% of these occurred in Penobscot County. And so this again is where I'm saying we can extrapolate some of our Penobscot County data, especially in this area, because, a lot of times they are coming here, for our acute care facilities. And then we also think of alcohol-induced deaths, which also include motor vehicle crashes where alcohol is a contributing factor. So some of these statistics you have to think about, what is an induced death? So it can be a lot of different things. And then opioid poisoning in the emergency department. We again see Bangor as having an elevated rate, and a lot of that is because we do have 2 emergency departments here. Next slide, Courtney.
Can we go back
Sure.
2 slides?
2 slides.
The insurance coverage 66% of kids up to 19 are in main care.
Mhm.
That's an incredibly high figure.
It is.
All right, I just wanted to make that point.
So what that says to me is that 66% of all of those children
Are living in-
qualify, are living in a household that qualifies. Yeah. Yeah. Next 2. I think that's where we were. There we go. Okay, so we've been collecting some of this data over the last couple of slides, and I wanted to put it together and kind of package it in a way that we can think about how public health needs kind of really envelop some of our social problems that we're also seeing as well. And so this is actually called despair, and it's an actual real set of conditions. And it's actually, the figures arrive from the percent of the population that are divorced or separated, the percentage of the population in the labor force that's unemployed, and the percentage of white men with high school education or lower. And they kind of mix that up with a couple of other smaller indices. And some of the things that we found that were surprising was that Bangor has the 5th highest divorce rate in the United States. I did not know this. So I need more like date restaurants or something, I don't know. We also, we do have a comparably low unemployment rate, so that's really good for us. But what we do have is, of course, substance use and overdose disproportionately impacted in Penobscot County. Our suicide rates are the 2nd leading cause of death among individuals aged 15 to 34. And then housing insecurity, unemployment, and poverty definitely impact this trend. And, maintaining adequate levels of support for this is one of the, the principal things that we would be concerned about. Okay, so the key takeaways here to kind of summarize, our population continues on a downward trend, but the change in composition and age of our residents is more prominent. So we're having, even though we have less individual residents that are 62 and older, we're finding them in more households, for example. The median age is growing younger, older adults, make up 20% of the population. The majority of Bangor's households either have children under age 18 or an older resident, so a large share there. Our public schools are outperforming the state and the region, but students may struggle to transition to work or post-secondary options. The city has a higher concentration of people living below the federal poverty level than the surrounding area, and interrelated issues around mental health, substance use, houselessness, and poverty pose critical challenges. And then Bangor and Penobscot County experience a disproportionate rate of overdose deaths compared to the state, and substance use is a critical concern in Bangor. Things that we knew anecdotally, and now we see also in the data. All right, next slide, please. So we're going to look at some housing trends. We are looking at a couple of things. So we're going to measure quality and affordability, specifically measuring housing problems. So we're looking at the community housing assessment framework, and that provides us with information. This is a subset of data within the Census Bureau that basically collects it all that's related to housing. HUD defines a severe housing problem as a household experiencing at least one of these conditions. So the housing unit lacks complete kitchen facilities, lacks complete plumbing facilities, is severely crowded, so more than 1.5 people per room, or the household is severely cost burdened. Either the household spends more than 50% of its income on housing costs, which is severely cost burdened. To be simply cost burdened, it would be over 30%. So there's some measures and some tiered measures of that. Next slide, please, Courtney. So we went and we looked at the data and extrapolated it out to look at the different income bands. So our income bands are the extremely low income, which is 0% to 30% of the area median income, very low income, which is between 30 and 50, moderate low income is 50 to 80, and then everything from 80 to 100% is considered moderate income. So here, some of the notable things are, you see this red, extremely low income bands. They're severely impacted by housing cost burden. They're severely impacted by any housing problem. And mostly you're going to see in the other categories that as you continue to move across the scale, that yellow with the moderate low income and the moderate income, there's no numbers there because they're not experiencing those housing problems. So you look at the no housing problems category, moderately low income, 1740, they're doing okay. And then moderate income probably has a little bit smaller share. So that's the distribution among the income bands. We sort of expected some of this to come through. Next slide, please. So another thing that we wanted to look at was how these housing problems relate to people that rent or they own their home. Anecdotally, we are aware of, older adults that live alone in, a home that they own, and sometimes there's some deferred maintenance issues. What are some of the housing problems that we noticed among renters? And it was pretty stark when we made this graph that everyone that has one or more housing problems is more likely an extremely low income renter or a very low income renter. And then thirdly, are in extremely low income owner. So we're really looking at those subsets of the population that have very, very low income, have not either, been able to own a home, and so they're, out on the rental market, or perhaps as an ELI owner, they are, an older person, perhaps on a fixed income or other type of scenario, and they're experiencing most often they're experiencing a cost burden, but they could also be experiencing some, housing quality issue as well. So, next slide, please. This is another way to look at renters versus owners. So we just aggregated all of this data to find that renters really do have a disproportionate impact of housing problems. So this is just another way to look at that. So renters are two times more likely to experience housing problems. And more commonly, it's the cost burden that's higher than 50% of their monthly income, as opposed to the cost burden of 30% of their income. Yes, ma'am.
Are these statistics Bangor's or national or Penobscot County, or what? What
These
mean?
are specific to Bangor.
These are specific to Bangor. Okay.
Want to do the next slide? So we also wanted to see, we dug a little deeper to find out about housing problems, to see if they could be extrapolated by race and ethnicity. We did find, if you look here, one or more housing problems, again, is in the blue. No housing problems is in the purple. And you're going to see how many housing problems among non-white individuals is 95% of them, and just 5% of them have no housing problems. So that's a really interesting statistic, sort of an aggregate. But you'll also notice that 100% of residents that identify as Native American or American Alaskan Native experience housing problems of some type. And then on the left side, we're looking at the entire jurisdiction. So we're about half and half, but see how it just gets disproportionate as you continue to look down to the right, those blue sections go up pretty wildly. Next slide, please, Courtney. So then we looked at housing cost burden related to owners that have a mortgage, owners that don't have a mortgage, because we wanted to see a little bit more about how this cost burden plays out. Owners without a mortgage make up the smallest share of cost burden households, which we thought we might see. But then 24% of all renter households are the severely cost burdened type. So 24% of all renter households, regardless of your income band, is a pretty significant number. And when compared to the state, I believe that we were about 4 points higher. So we do have a lot of cost burden in Bangor specifically, but we have seen that anecdotally, and it did come out in the data as well. And many extremely low income renters, I think it's important to also remember that many of them live in some type of subsidized housing. Not as many as there are renters. We only have so much subsidized housing, but ownership seems to make a big difference in this class as far as whether or not they're cost burdened. So, and then we'll go to the next slide, please. So when we think about public housing, we have about 700 public housing units. These are, the Capehart and the new Capehart units. They meet a range of housing needs, including low-income multifamily housing, senior housing, and homeless housing. However, only about 11% of all of their housing is actually handicap accessible. Found that out. That's interesting to know. So really focusing on how much accessible housing we have in the city, starts with a good inventory of what accessible housing we have that's also subsidized. The Bangor Housing Authority also has a wait list of over 1,000 families. And I believe 700 of those on that waiting list are seniors looking for housing. So some of the things that we've seen is the availability of appropriate housing is really important in thinking about how we're going to produce this extra housing that we actually need. How do we decide, what kind of housing there is that's available? And because we're seeing a lot of need for accessible housing, and we have, this waiting list of 700 seniors looking for senior housing, this indicates that this would be an area of really high need and high priority.
Quick question. Of the families in public housing on the wait list, how many of them are from Bangor?
I do not. I'm not sure if they collect that. It's a good question, though. Very curious.
And then the Public Housing Authority's program exceeds the federal targeting requirements by having 70% of move-ins being extremely low income. So that's something that they measure. And they have a minimum floor of 40%. So they're really targeting a specific population there for their programs.
Next slide, Courtney.
There we go. So one thing that we also look at when we talk about housing and kind of getting into the middle of the data that we have in other plans and we have in other studies is really looking at the disproportionate risk. What makes a resident more at risk for having housing problems, but then also obtaining certain housing related to some type of population characteristic. So we did find that young adults aged 25 to 34, as well as older adults, so older than 62, increase the demand for smaller one-bedroom units. So we don't have enough to meet that need because of the population characteristic and our household size of only 2.2 residents. Now we're looking at, we need a lot of one-bedroom units. And then housing for persons with disabilities and extremely low-income people. They struggle to find housing and are more at risk of being homeless because they can't access their housing. They're also potentially living in housing that is not appropriate for them. We have in Bangor like a really high fall rate for seniors. Once they fall in their home, sometimes they can't return home. So that can be a struggle when you're thinking about accessible housing. What are the long-term effects of that? Could be people that want to age in place really struggle to do that. And then when compared to statewide data, Bangor residents experience a higher level of cost burden, again, as we mentioned. And individuals that struggle to make ends meet that access our general assistance program. We looked at some data here. Their housing is of poor quality, they report. They have difficulty finding housing, due to affordability, rejection due to past evictions, felony records, poor credit. Units that don't pass inspection, that's actually a really difficult thing. If you have a housing voucher, you do need to find a unit that will pass certain inspection points and life and safety. And at times, voucher holders are waiting about 18 months with a voucher, trying to find a unit that will meet their needs. And that also creates a risk of being homeless, even if you have, the ability to pay your rent. And then in general, individuals and families with incomes below 30% AMI, which is the poverty level, and households that are severely cost burdened are at an increased risk of housing instability and homelessness, and just a cycle that continues. Okay, so let's look at some takeaways.
Perfect.
So based on the number of units that report one or more housing conditions, there's definitely a need of owner and rental rehab in the city. This is something that we've really, community development is primarily concerned with. Housing quality issues that result from the age of Bangor's housing stock, and the lack of investment over time are of concern. Inadequate housing can present significant costs to homeowners, rentals, and landlords as you continue to kind of let things go. It becomes more costly to repair that in the future. So the age of Bangor's housing stock is one of the larger concerns that the city has in addressing housing needs. An aged housing stock can mean lower quality of housing and greater risk for lead-based paint. The need for rehab is not concentrated in rental units or in owner-occupied units. It's universal across unit types. Bangor can address these needs by dedicating more federal and local dollars into improving and maintaining the existing housing stock. And specifically, what we found was that just under 10,000 of Bangor's housing units that were built before 1980, both owner-occupied and renter-occupied, 1,103 are occupied by families with young children under the age of 6. So this is what the metric that we use when we're thinking about lead-based paint is the presence of children that are under 6 years old. These 1,103 are at greatest risk of lead-based paint exposure based on the number of owner-occupied units available to 0 to 30 AMI families. The households most affected by lead-based paint risk are going to be any households between 31 to 100% AMI. So that really is a large share of families in Bangor if they're occupying some of these older homes and they have children under the age of 6. This is something that Bangor Public Health, they offer the lead-based paint testing. And then also we have a program for lead-based paint remediation. So it's definitely a concern that we're trying to address. And I think it'll, turn up soon. Okay, so we did a market analysis into our housing. We looked at some of the units by tenure. So how many 3-bedroom units to 1? You'll notice, as we said before, 1-bedroom units for rental really need some help. 1-bedroom owner units, we just don't really have a lot of those. They're not really building condos as much as they were. And so we're not going to see a lot of 1-bedroom, single family homes. 3-bedroom owner units are primarily what we have in the city. These are the older homes. A lot of them are, on the west side of Bangor. And so the number of units per family type there's an incongruent set of data there. So we have 15,559 housing units. Seems like a lot. So we have our single family units are the largest share of that. And we actually have 1,095 manufactured housing units in Bangor. Actually, 25% of those housing units are older than the 1976 marker for being having the safe housing. So these are some that could be replaced and probably should be focused on. We also have a higher demand for smaller units because we have 1-person households that make up 40% of all Bangor resident households. The vacancy rate for the city was hovering around 9%. And I believe in 2025's data, it's gone down to about 5%, but it's significantly lower than the state as a whole. So what the vacancy rate means essentially is that there's just nothing open for someone that's looking for an apartment. And maybe they're looking to move to a new apartment because, their family got larger and they're moving within Bangor, or it could be, that we're trying to hire another teacher or something and they can't find housing within Bangor. So it does definitely make a difference in the amount of appropriate housing stock and the vacancy rate as a whole. Next slide, please, Whitney. So now we're looking at housing unit affordability. We're looking again at our income bands and what's affordable to a family that's making 30%, 50, 80, or 100% AMI. What we're finding is that in the 30% band, we're really not seeing a lot of rental housing that's affordable to them. There's really just nothing there on that scale. Rentals tend to be a little bit more affordable until you hit about 80%. And now it's cheaper to buy at the 80% level. And then if you make 100% AMI, now you're back and you can't afford, to do that rental. So it's really interesting to find where we have affordable housing. And then our rents are the price point is a lot higher than it used to be. $2,000 or more, $15,000 to $2,000, $1,500 to $2,000 actually makes up a pretty big share of all of our rental units. We do have a good share of our units that are rated from $1,000 to $1,500. But there's gone are the days that you could rent an apartment for $500 or less. Okay, Courtney, you want to go to the next slide? So here we wanted to look at the rate of housing affordability with our median home prices, and then also to kind of compare them year over year as price increases. So our median home prices, we have Bangor and then we have Maine. You see that there is a sharp incline in the left graph, but it really kind of keeps in step with the state in the same curvature. But then if you look over here at the price increases year over year, you're actually seeing that in Maine, the median home price jumped 42% in 2021 and 35% in 2023. So some of our homes, like just in a year, jumping almost 50% in price. Next slide, please. So we took the same graph, median home price, and we decided to kind of put it in together with the area median income to see what we could learn. And here what we're seeing, our local AMI as related to the national AMI, I had this graph up a couple of slides back. We actually see that our income has sharply increased, but yet our median home prices to purchase a home is not really keeping up with that same curvature. So it's becoming increasingly more difficult for people of average or even moderate incomes to be able to buy a home. So if we want to go to the next slide, we'll look at that a little bit.
Before you go, on the, was it the area median income? So what's the area? Is that Bangor or is that the area?
Yeah, so when they define the area, they're actually looking at what they call the Bangor Metropolitan Statistical Area. And largely that encompasses, I used to have a list of all so it's like.
No, so that's just kind of proving my point.
Yeah, it's like 13.
So it's incorporating a lot of the surrounding towns, which we know have higher incomes.
Yep.
And obviously Bangor has a higher concentration of people living below the poverty level. So it's kind of skewed.
It is
for
kind of
Bangor
skewed.
specific.
And one of the things that I think make that challenging is that HUD bases a lot of our, Bangor-based formulaic grants and a lot of things on this area median income, even, the specific rent limits, income limits. And this can pose an issue because it is skewed by the bedroom communities of Bangor that could have more affluent residents. And so that is absolutely a challenge. I don't know how to get over it. But yeah, it definitely an observation. So I made a table here to kind of show a little bit more about what our median incomes, and this is the unadjusted median income, what that translates as an hourly wage, and then our median home prices as we've gone from 2013 to 2024. And so what this is actually showing is the income that's needed to become a homeowner at the median home price, and the income that you need extrapolated as a hourly wage figure to rent the median 2-bedroom apartment. And year over year, we see that in 2013, you'd have money to spare. You could rent, you could own, didn't matter. Anyone could buy, anyone could rent. It starts out around 2020, rents start getting higher, homes start to kind of jump up a little bit, not too much, but a little bit. We had a huge price increase between 22, 23, and 24. So now we have income shortfalls of about $22,000 for an average person to try to buy a house. So this is something that we actually see in community development. We run a down payment assistance, closing cost assistance program. And so we're actually seeing anecdotally that, you know, this is a bigger problem to try to help people qualify for homes. If they're buying the home that they can afford, they can't get approval because the appraisal won't support the price, or because they can't get a, you know, combination rehab loan. So it can be really challenging to try to buy a home that you can afford if your mortgage company won't let you buy that house. So a lot of in the rent, you even have, you need to make $34.15. This is one person though. Maybe two people don't need that, right? But we're thinking about what are the scenarios in households that make it particularly challenging. What if you were just the one earner, right? You'd have, and you need a second bedroom, you know, you're raising a child, for example. So this is where sometimes you say, oh, well, two people, you know, you can split the $34.15. Now we have two people on minimum wage. But what if it's one person? One person on minimum wage can't rent a 2-bedroom apartment unless they have some type of housing help. So this is where we think, what are the resources, you know, for the housing help, the subsidized housing, and the backlog of some of these waiting lists and things like that. So we want to go to the next. So we came into thinking about what kind of jobs are we trying to find so that we can afford to buy a house or to rent an apartment in Bangor. And it's really, really, really hard to find any job that's going to be able to pay $34 an hour, right? So to go with what we know, we decided to look at our own jobs, and we found that an aircraft mechanic can rent an apartment in Bangor, but unless they live with another person, you know, they're going to struggle to be able to buy a house within Bangor at the prices that we looked at on the previous slide. So then let's go to the next slide and we'll see a little bit more about other jobs in Bangor. One thing that we do want to also talk about is, you know, suppose that you have that aircraft mechanic and a Bangor firefighter, they decide to buy a home and raise a family. There are a lot of other things that go into, you know, maintaining that home and paying your water and sewer bill and a lot of these things. So it's really contributing to some of that cost burden. And so we actually worked, the Bangor Chamber helped to assemble this data from the Maine Workforce Development Board that shows the different occupations in Bangor, the number of people that are employed in those occupations, and the average salaries. And pretty much across the board, the salaries, you know, they're, you know, kind of all over the place. But one thing you'll see, we noticed sales had a pretty low salary, but these are averages. Again, when you're averaging something, there's some skew between maybe commission-based sales and then retail sales, which can be on two ends of the spectrum. So that might account for some of these salaries maybe being lower than expected. Yeah, so other industry sectors, are encountering these similar problems of being able to offer a good salary and recruit people to come to Bangor. So can we do the next slide, please? So we looked a little bit further at some of those industries that were reported by the chamber. Our 5 key economic drivers are healthcare, education, tourism. We also have education. So Husson University, we have a lot of colleges here in the area that contribute to jobs. We employ over 9,900 people in Bangor in the education industry. So whether they're commuting to University of Maine is also a key. Healthcare, we know that we do have 2 of the largest acute care, general medicine, and then 1 psychiatric care facility. They do have high employment and payroll, over 15,000 people in that sector in this region. So it's not just in Bangor, but they do have the highest annual payroll because, again, we're kind of looking at a very specialty occupations like doctors and that kind of thing. The rapidly rising senior population contributes to the job growth in health practitioner support occupations because it's driving up the need. Next slide, please. So we're looking at retail trade. We have Hannaford, Walmart, a lot of the big box stores among the top employers in this sector. It is a regional retail sector. We know we have had, in historical past, lots of people, would come by the busload to shop in Bangor. Retail trade employs over 10,500 people in Bangor. And they aren't necessarily Bangor residents, so we need to remember that. We also have manufacturing, we have aerospace, wood products, and food processing. That requires a skilled workforce, stable employment opportunities across various fields such as machine operators, engineers, and quality control. And the state of Maine is investing in innovation and aiming to expand strengths in industries like forest products and advanced manufacturing. So how can we kind of harness some of this growth and innovation, perhaps in the housing sector with some type of, building products? Those are some things to look out for. Next slide, please. Then we look at tourism and hospitality. This is something that we've been thinking about. How are we, outdoor recreation hub? How can we increase the physical activity? We have a proximity to attractions like Acadia National Park, but what can we do to kind of get the destination Bangor feel? We do have concerts and events, so that's a real big feather in our cap is that we have the largest venue north of Boston with a Maine Savings Amphitheater. It has 17,500 seats. So that's a big driver for nightly events. And then other contributing sectors, we think about, the finance and insurance sector. We have transportation and warehousing. We have an airport. That's a really great feature. It's a port of entry and part of the international trade zone, which really is another feather in Bangor's cap and definitely a resource that we can use. And then we also have professional, scientific, and technical services that contribute significantly to the economy. Although it doesn't really show high employment numbers, it's an economic driver because it's actually driving innovation. And then again, forest products and agriculture, this is, where Bangor's identity, was sort of based on with the lumber industry. But we do see a lot of economic stability with some of these heritage organizations. Next slide, please, Courtney. So we can talk about economic development in terms of the civilian labor force. So we have a population of 16,396 people in the civilian labor force, which is actually defined as people that are aged 16 to 65. And then the civilian population that are employed 16 and over is about 15,667. So our unemployment rate is a little low, but it has reduced over the last 3 years. So this is actually the lowest that it's been since 2021. And then extrapolating, we have a lower unemployment rate for ages 16 to 24. This is actually a social trend. We're seeing young adults as they reach the age of majority, they're getting slower at achieving certain milestones like getting your driver's license, getting your first apartment, getting your first job. Those things are kind of happening a little bit later. So starting at age 25, you're seeing more movement on that. So it's another trend. And then from age 25 to 65, you have a more what you might consider typical or anticipated unemployment rate. Commuters to Bangor. We have 20,000 people that commute to Bangor. One interesting thing to note is that it's been estimated that our daytime population is about 110,000 people. I find that really interesting because you're thinking about people that visit for non-work items too. The people that live and work in Bangor comprise the other 11,000 people. So it's really interesting to see like where people are coming from to work. People mostly travel under 30 minutes. So this tells us more about what we call the bedroom communities of Bangor. You know, can be those that live in Camden, Herman, Eddington, Vesey, and have a job and come to Bangor. The other portion of the 110,000, I don't know what they're doing, but they like it because they're doing it. These are also people that are accessing the services that we have in Bangor and things like that. So just another number to kind of round that out. Next slide, please. So we're still looking at our labor force and we're combining that with some statistics on educational attainment because we found some interesting trends. So we showed that, you know, less than a high school graduate, we have low numbers of that in the city. But most of them are employed. They've got a job, they're doing something. And then the other folks are not in the labor force. And we suspect that that is homemaker style. These are going to be your older adults that chose not to be in the labor force versus exited the labor force for another reason. We have high school graduates, which include the GED equivalency. Most are employed. And then the lion's share of people that are in the labor force have a bachelor's degree or higher. So these are actually some pretty good numbers when you think about matching up the educational attainment with what employment opportunities are here. Because what this says is we can bring industries to Bangor that require skilled labor because we have it. So that's really interesting to see. And then I've extrapolated some of the median earnings based on educational attainment here. But one thing I think that you should see is on the next slide, Courtney, is when we take those median earnings in the last 12 months and we divide them to see what our income discrepancy is according to sex, we actually see the same thing. You know, the national trend is reflected here as well. We have male earners are consistently making more in each category, except only slightly less in high school graduates, because you don't see any females that are less than high school graduates on our scale. So there was no measurable data for females without a high school degree or a diploma. Next slide, please, Courtney. So here's our takeaways. So when a business looks to expand in Bangor, they can expect to draw from the greater Bangor region, which is made up of over 150,000 people. So you're right, Councilor Fournier, when we're talking about the area median, it's really talking about almost the entire county. There are opportunities for emerging and established businesses to collaborate with and for residents to develop new skills to meet the needs of a changing workforce. So this says that we have a lot of potential for economic development because we've, laid some groundwork here in our workforce. In addition to these targeted industries, we are anecdotally aware of the need for other skilled labor in specifically the construction and building industries. And that is largely due to the increased demand, but this is also due to emerging and advanced building and materials and industry standards. Things like energy efficiency and heat pumps and things like that are becoming more popular. Also, the healthcare and hospitality service sectors are a large driver in our economy. So as we continue to support those specific types of occupations, because we're only going to see that go up. The highest growth sector in Bangor, which is the health services and education, are employment areas that generally require an associate's degree or higher. So this is a shift from the historical labor patterns of Bangor, which relied more on manufacturing, agricultural, and manual occupations. So this is where we're thinking if we are trending toward residents with higher education levels, because that is what the economic opportunities require. We need to focus and make sure that there's a greater need in education and training in Bangor who is able to access those types of opportunities to be able to drive our economy and give us those really great jobs and the results that those jobs will have on Bangor residents. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about that and the access to great opportunities and prosperity, we need to take all of this, mix it up in a soup, and then add our consideration for special needs populations, because we want to make sure that we're thinking about the ability for all residents to be able to access all of these great things. So our special needs populations include older adult households, which HUD does call them elderly, but we call them older adult households. But if you see it anywhere, it's HUD wants it that way. We also think about persons with mobility challenges, persons with other disabilities that aren't mobility challenges. High healthcare consumers are going to be those with substance abuse disorder or HIV and AIDS. We have unstably housed, chronically homeless persons. We have the low and moderate income individuals and households, and then we have victims of abuse, neglect, or violence. Next slide, please. So looking at elderly households, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry. Householders age 65 or older living alone, specifically in that pie, it was 15% of all of those people that live alone. 15% of those are age 65 or older living alone. So I had alluded to this earlier that we have a lot of people that are single householders that need that one bedroom apartment. Well, 15% of all of those are over 65 and 7% of those are over 75. So that's a remarkable thing because these are people that are trying to age in place. 68% of all cost-burdened owner households and 60% of severely cost-burdened owner households were elderly households, and 100% of elderly households are cost-burdened. So any of those households are going to be paying at least 30%, but more between 30 and 50% of their income on housing. And then since 2012, we've had a sharp increase in the 62 plus population, which in the last 4 years started to drop. We did have a sharp decrease in the population related to COVID-19, so that's important to remember. So some of the data we can't think of as like a trend necessarily. There are some of these disruptions that we have to think about in the data as, maybe it's explained by other factors. Next slide, please. So we discussed that 21% of Bangor's population has a disability. The most common of these were intellectual disabilities. We do have a number of local organizations that help to care for some of these folks. And those types of disabilities can range from being as severe as you might need to have care, but there might be independent people also. I just want to differentiate. Independent living difficulties comprised 41% of those, and then ambulatory difficulties, so difficulty getting around, were very common. And then the median income for people with disabilities was about $18,000 compared to $40,000 for folks without a disability. So it's really interesting to see the juxtaposition of the numbers of the amount of money that you can earn if you have a disability. Next slide, please, Courtney. So high healthcare consumers included people that use drugs. 20%. So we don't really have a lot of like concrete data about the number of people in Bangor specifically, but we estimate that 20% of individuals aged 12 and older living in the entire state report substance use disorders in the past year. So this is already higher than the national average. Bangor had 300% more overdose deaths than Penobscot County and the state of Maine in 2022. That's another interesting metric, but we kind of knew just anecdotally, and we live here and we work here and we've seen things. So this is something that kind of confirms some concerns that we already have. And then annually, we have about 1,200 emergency medical services incidents that require naloxone for overdose. And then another thing that's interesting that we found was 43 retail opioid prescriptions are dispensed per 100 people each year. And that is another Penobscot County statistic, but it's really interesting because we have the opioid settlement funds. It really calls attention to the amount of opioid prescriptions that are in the community and perhaps manageable conditions with that kind of thing. And then,
Question. On the retail opiate prescriptions, would possibly be the reason we have so many because of the health facilities we have.
that's absolutely true.
So we don't know if these retail prescriptions were for local people or were for people from Washington County or.
Well, they could. That's possible that they could live that far away. I wonder though if they might have used a more local pharmacy, but that's interesting to think about where they might live. It is really kind of hard to measure some things when people collect data for perhaps their own purposes, and you kind of have to make it work for what you want to know. But what we do know is that we do have hospitals that have inpatient facilities, and so we measure something called preventable hospital stays. So conditions that are related to ambulatory care, sensitive conditions like you walk in rather than you're in an ambulance, and was that stay preventable, maybe with better outpatient healthcare or some other type of thing. And so we actually have a higher incidence of preventable health hospital visits and emergency department visits. And the reason that that's relevant is because we're looking at that as a strain on the healthcare system. When we have a lot of patients in hospitals, then we know that when we have some type of healthcare disruption, that might occur, in the winter months or something, we have, hospitals that have that type of performance. All right, and so then we're rounding that out. Next slide, please. So now this is second to last slide. The HIV and AIDS cell epidemic that we're dealing with right now is pretty remarkable. The state of Maine, CDC states that this is probably the largest spike that we've seen as a state. We have 36 new HIV cases in 23, but then 26 new just in the last 8 months of this year. 88% of all recent cases involve persons that were unhoused within 1 year. And so I've included a graph here that came from the Maine CDC that tracks all of the diagnosis case rates. So we're looking at February of 2025, a big spike, and then, we're still collecting case rates here as well. The CDC was where I came from before I went to regional planning, so I'm always interested to see what numbers they can give us. And this definitely is a concern for Bangor because, we're looking at the unhoused population, and so we're keeping an eye on this. So that's really important. Okay. And then my last slide sums this up. So we have the populations of Bangor that are reporting poor physical health days and poor mental health days were both elevated from the national average and the state average as well. 15% of all adults report poor mental health each month, and 29% report experiencing depression at some point in our lifetime. The biggest takeaway here is the rate of suicide among youth aged 10 to 19 nearly doubled between 2015 and 2021. So we've got some trends here that are really interesting that we, want to consider moving forward. And then finally, last slide. Okay, so our analysis of our vulnerable populations and services. So we have persons in their households with children, chronically homeless individuals, and families. We're seeing that most of these are sheltered. Unsheltered people typically are only adult households. And it really to ensure an adequate supply of the appropriate housing to prevent chronic homelessness, and that we ensure that medical, mental health, and substance abuse needs are met so they don't interfere with their ability to access housing. So our next steps after looking at these is we're going to be looking at some infrastructure. We're going to be looking at like transportation needs, our broadband. We're going to look at some of our public facilities and other assets to which can provide answers for how we're going to look at some of these other needs. What do we have in the community that can help us face that are resources for that? So our next steps are going to create a strategic plan that kind of brings all that together. And that draft will come out around November, and we'll be able to share that with you at that time. We're getting close.
Questions for Robin? Councilor Fish.
That was depressing.
A little bit.
A great emphasis of it is a lot about our economic challenged population.
Right.
The majority of the report really reflected a lot on that segment of our population, our unhoused population. And I'm just kind of surprised I don't see more of an interjection of what I see in real estate. Our saturation point is still around 4, which means our housing we don't have, whenever anything comes on the market for sale, it sells very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And the average sales price is actually now a little higher than 280 for year to date. I think it's pushing 300, over 300, and they're selling like that.
Yeah.
And the people that are in our population has actually decreased, and yet we have had some housing projects in development. I know the Woods project, they had how many housing units, 60 or so, and those were in the $200,000 range, I think.
Mhm.
And we did have a lot of single people that were able within that income range that you reflected, able to buy those.
Yeah.
So, and we've had substantial new construction. Yet the population has decreased, and in real estate, I'm seeing whatever inventory comes in the higher range is selling. And I just don't see what I see every day working in the field. I
Yeah.
just don't see that positive, day to day. Positive in one hand that we do have people able to afford to pay for those houses coming here. The majority, well, maybe 50%, maybe coming in from other locations, but they're coming with their services, their skills, their education, and coming into the Bangor market. And I just don't see that reflected anywhere here.
Yeah. As a needs assessment, I think they are kind of typically more negative. But I agree with you. Those are data points that we did see with the days on the market. One thing when we look at our housing units and the fact that our population has decreased, but we're building more housing, is that we also have had a housing loss due to chronic disinvestment. We've had a lot of placarded properties that we've had to deal with. So housing loss at times has accounted for some of the gap that's sort of like the unseen. And then in the rental housing market, some of our hidden units, I call hidden units because they're not units that we can count yet, but yet people are living in them. So the data isn't going to show that until we actually tease out what the actual units are. But I agree with you, it can be a little more on the negative to kind of go through this needs assessment because it is so focused on, kind of the lower 50% of our population. But perhaps there's a way that we can, continue to interject more.
So I just want to understand, may I continue? This economic community report on housing, was it intentionally geared to the more vulnerable group and low income? Or was this, because I just don't see our strategic plan being a little more, taking advantage more of the people that are coming and the vibrant economic group we do have. And so I just don't know, when we do get down to our strategic plan,
Right.
How are we, how are we going to take advantage of the fact that we're a gateway to two huge tourist destinations?
Right.
And how can we, maybe extrapolate a little more from that? And I just don't want to get us too narrow focused on, yes, a vulnerable group that needs us. But I also think that Bangor is a vibrant,
Absolutely.
community, and we do have housing that is selling, hot off the shelf. And I just don't want to lose the economic people that still need our support and attention to continue the livelihood, and yet still help, how many of our children are on main care? I mean, that's a pretty mind-blowing figure.
Right.
So I think somewhere just didn't see that represented in this report.
Absolutely. And Councillor Fish, I think I can address that by saying, so this is a complementary document. So it actually comprises sort of like a wedge of a pie where some of that vibrancy for moderate to more affluent individuals or, the industry sectors as a whole are really addressed in like our comprehensive plan or our community and economic development strategy. This specifically is a plan though to target low and moderate income people to be able to figure out how they can be kind of lifted to the rest of us. So it is a narrow focus, like you said, but we do try to make sure that it will complement the rest of the population, those industries that are so important that they want to participate in. So how can we kind of bring that up?
Thank you. That was so that was the purpose, was to focus on that. So now I get it. Okay, great.
And then we can think about how do we spend CDBG funds to make some of these metrics.
Bring these people up to be more.
Other questions? Councilor Leonard?
Just looking at this report, it reflects to me what is typical, what happens with gentrification, basically. Maine has been seeing a lot more people, not just in Bangor, but just throughout the state, moving to this area. And when people move to this area, part of gentrification is they also bring with them higher salaries as well. And when you have higher salaries, that's going to increase the overall average rent rate or the average home buying rate. And the issue I'm seeing here with these numbers is that the local population cannot keep up with it. I mean, we do have to understand that this is one of the poorest congressional districts east of the Mississippi. And your report basically tells me that we as a city need to be even more aggressive when it comes to low-income housing and also regulatory practices that the city should take, because we are leaving people behind, it looks like. And it's just very concerning seeing a lot of young people that are very educated, coming from a great school system, and a lot of people just want to stay here and be with their families. But if things continue to become more and more unaffordable to them, our local population is just going to leave Maine for better pastures. So, I mean, I'm looking forward to your future reports, because right now what I'm seeing is just very alarming, and we need to take a much more aggressive look at what we can do for housing. What was the state number of, I think it was 84,000 homes that need to be built by 2030. That's the goal for the state of Maine. I think that's even a low figure overall statewide, but your report tells me that we need to be a leader in regards to that number. We need to not only help developers build, but we as a city should be investing in homes, especially the low income, low affordability homes, because what tends to happen in the private market is when you have developers that want to build low income households in 2 to 3 years, they just go to market rate basically. So we have to get a control on that, because otherwise these prices are just going to balloon and balloon and balloon, and we're just going to be leaving people behind. Thank you for your report. I really appreciate it. And it's unfortunate.
Sorry to address everyone.
No, but it's important to have these conversations. It really is. Thank you, Bob.
Councilor Beck.
I think this report makes an excellent case for an affordable housing bond. Something we saw in our housing study that recommended that, something like Rockland did, revenue neutral. Because developers have consistently said, help us mitigate the risk, help us increase the margins, and we'll come build. But until you do that, we won't come. And I think the only way we're going to do that is if we find a way to put some serious skin in the game, and CDBG funds just aren't enough, and we need to, come up with a better tool to work with developers and get them here. And the only way I'm seeing that is to do that affordable housing bond.
Other comments, questions?
Sorry.
Councilor Leonard?
I would actually just concur with that idea, Councilor Beck. If possible in the future, I would actually like that to be a discussion sooner rather than later. I think that's an excellent point to make.
Thank you for the report. A lot of information. Thank you. Good job. One more item on the agenda. We all set? One more item on the agenda.
Yeah, just one more, yeah. Just wanted to give a director report, something thinking about doing every month or every other month, just to outline all the different projects. Because sometimes the projects that we're working on may not be ready for an agenda item or council order, but we just want you to know what the progress is and be able to answer any questions that you may have. The good news is we have a new director of code enforcement, Laura Jarrell. She lives in Dover Foxcroft. She moved here from Florida where she worked about 20 years in the profession. So she brings some good insight and good background. So she started today, so we're really excited to have her here. Robin, as you can
Councilor
tell,
Long.
oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just have
Yeah,
a
yeah,
question. So the 26th, the general public code enforcement meeting, will they be leading that discussion? I only ask it because they're just so new. I just want to make
The
sure.
land use next week?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's out of planning.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. I'm
That's
sorry.
all right,
Thank
yeah,
you.
that's okay. But we'll have code there as well, staff there to hear what, folks have to say. So in community development, as you can see, what Robin's been working on, she's been working hard on the consolidated plan. To keep that moving along. In economic development, we've been focused, the economic development officer has been focused a lot on a foreign trade zone, working with the airport staff. And they meet on a regular basis to talk about all of the different projects that the airport has, and all of the properties that are around the airport, just trying to coordinate those marketing efforts of those properties. The bid set for the commercial kitchen project is almost ready to go out. So that project is moving along, which is fantastic. So, and we're working on a management plan for the facility. So that was, we had done in the past, we had done a feasibility study, we had done some strategic work on the facility, but now we're kind of getting into the particulars. So we'll be working on that management plan at a staff level. And then planning board keeps us busy, and but we've also been working on the land use plan implementation project that's coming to you next Monday at pre-council as a joint meeting with planning board. We're trying to use our consultants' time wisely by having they come and instead of doing two separate meetings with planning board and with the council, we're just doing that as a combined. And then the next day we're having actually two public meetings, one at noon time and one after work for people in the public. So the one at noon time will be here, and the one after work on Tuesday will be at the library at 5 o'clock. And we're also working on all of the properties for taking for taxes, the vacant property list, the placard list. We kind of have them combined, and going through the procedures that are required, a notification for that. So it's a long process that we have to follow with the state statute, but that is a priority project between code and myself working on that. And a bunch of other departments. There's a lot of staff that's involved in that. And then this summer we've been working with Lisa Sturgeon, who's running the rural economy grant project that we had gotten from EPA. And she's been running that effort, and now we're going into branding activities. So if you are on social media, you might see, if you go to Greater Bangor Region or GBR, there's some graphics that we're floating out there to get some feedback. So take a look at those, and we'll be making a more formal presentation to BED in your second meeting in September, just to give you an update on that. So that project's moving along.
Great. Any questions for Ann?
Good stuff.
Yes.
Good stuff.
Exciting.
Anything else for the committee?